This building has been at the heart of Blackpool for 140 years. You cannot move something, you cannot change something without uncovering another thing. And it's this journey of discovery that has become really important to me, both as a person who loves the building, but also as the person who is responsible for that, sort of the protection of its significance and its historic character. The Winter Gardens opened on the 11th of July 1878, and the Lord Mayor of London was in attendance along with 68 mayors and mayoresses from different towns all over the UK. Originally they would have come into something very like the entrance to the Crystal Palace through a great dome, a great glass dome in a rotunda, but then into this huge long corridor of sort of glass house really. The floor was all wooden, so it would have been a bit like sort of trip-trapping across a pier. And I think that it's actually been sort of associated with this feeling of an inland pier, this idea that it felt like you were going onto a pier, but you were completely enclosed. Most of the plants originally were planted below the floor because at that point there wasn't a basement to most of the complex. And of course, the experience would have been different dependent on which way you came into the building. If you came in from the Coronation Street, Victoria Street side, you'd have been faced by this building that was like a small French chateau across very formally set out gardens. And within that building, you'd have had a choice of different activities. You could do eating and drinking. The Pavilion Theatre was attached to that, so you could potentially go and watch a recital, performance, concert. Bear in mind that this was built at a time when Blackpool was still focused on sort of middle and upper class visitors, so they were providing fairly highbrow performance and entertainment in there. There was a gymnasium in there originally, which was subsequently replaced by a billiard room. But beyond that, you'd have gone then into this huge glass corridor, which, if you entered from the Church Street side, would have been your first experience coming through this glass house and then accessing again, as you turn right towards what was called the Grand Vestibule building, this little French chateau, the facilities in there, or going on forward into the sort of main performance space in the Pavilion Theatre. So it was different from the Crystal Palace in that there was more architecture about it that was solid architecture. Everything done in Italian Renaissance style. There is a whole wall of these rather beautiful plaster panels by the sculptor Bruciani, which were all about setting this sort of romantic Renaissance theme for the more solid parts of this building. But it would have been something completely different. There wasn't anywhere else like it. There were earlier Winter Gardens, but they weren't the same as this. They weren't on the same scale, they weren't as lavish, not as much money had been spent. Blackpool was very good at pioneering and doing things first, but it also did a lot of things second, looking at the risks other people took, looking at how they dealt with those risks and how they were able to overcome them, and then effectively delivering something bigger, better, and much more elaborate for the visitor. The building has evolved through a curious mixture of sort of social movement in terms of what people expected, the more sophisticated aspects of what holidaymakers wanted at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. But it's also been about rivalry. Initially, the Winter Gardens Company's rivalry with the Royal Palace Gardens Company, that closed very soon after the Winter Gardens opened. And then we have the rivalry with the Tower Company, which went on for 30 odd years from the time that the tower was built all the way through to the time when the Tower Company in 1929 bought the Winter Gardens Company out and effectively took possession of the building. You see big expressions of this in the Empress Ballroom. The Empress Ballroom was a direct response to the building of the Tower and the Tower Ballroom. This was a facility that the Winter Gardens didn't have, and therefore what they wanted was to do that, but do it bigger and do it better. We also have things like the Victoria Hall, the big 3-storey glass house on the western side of the site, which effectively provided a really grand entrance into the building. And of course, next to that, the big wheel, or the gigantic wheel, which was in fact one of the original Ferris wheels, the only survivor of which is the one at the Prater in Vienna. there was an expectation that potentially the Tower Company might not continue on with the Winter Gardens. But in the end, what happened was a little bit surprising. They went on to invest over the winter of 1930-31 £500,000 in money then, which is, tens of millions of pounds today. And they created a complex that was very much of its time. They introduced an awful lot of new Art Deco architecture and features into the building, which I think, that's the primary thing that you see when you go in today. There are still all those traces of the original Victorian building, but it's overlaid with this incredibly high quality interior which went in over that winter. They brought in key designers. Andrew Mazzei is the biggest amongst those names. He was the artistic director for Gaumont British and later Gaumont International, so effectively a Hollywood set designer for films. So this is why you have all these rich interiors from that period. It didn't stop there. There was a period sort of after the war where there was a bit of a lull because I guess people were still for a start, it would have been very difficult to get hold of the materials for a major refurbishment. So the next big thing really, I think, came in the 1960s when the Indian Lounge was removed to create the Planet Room, which is now the Arena. One of the great things about the Winter Gardens is that, the rooms have changed, but quite often those changes are quite superficial. So for instance, down in the Mazzei Cafe, which is our big ground floor space that the public tend to use, we discovered the original interior behind the later additions from the late 60s, early 70s. And, it was completely intact. So all we had to do was take those boards down, make a few repairs, and we had that original 1930-31 interior back. Some of the spaces, like the room that we're in now, the Grand Foyer, was originally the foyer for the second Opera House of 1911, but it was repurposed as a bar for the third Opera House of 1939. So you've got this continuity of use. I mean, the difference there is that, there was a floor inserted and, this is quite a spectacular space, double height space now, whereas originally it was, part of an entrance complex to the theatre. And I think that's very much the point. I think there was a recognised value in the interiors of the building. One of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with is navigating around the building. There isn't really always a logical route, and actually sometimes there's more than one. And that is to do with the fact that the site was originally a little bit more spread out. There was more open space on the site with outdoor gardens as well as, of course, the indoor glasshouses. But later on, these spaces were filled in. So you get these odd levels and you basically get little cut-throughs and kind of, not quite alleyways, but little corridors that lead to different spaces. And of course, a lot of this the public don't see. A lot of this is about servicing the building. And of course, that makes it quite complex too. It's when you look at particularly the additions from so for instance, the third Opera House was actually put onto a very constrained site. We had a series of connections they decided to keep. So the room that I'm in now was originally the main access staircase to the dress circle for the second Opera House, and they decided to retain it, which meant some very, very sort of difficult challenges with levels and some odd corridors for fire escapes, one of which has this spectacular view out into the dome and was, literally punched through the wall so that they could actually get this balconied area out over the dome for fire escape. So there's lots of little quirks in the building like that. And I think it's the kind of building that, certainly me, I've been sort of working with the building for 10 years, and I suspect there are still places that I haven't been. It's interesting because the two big kind of representations of the ambition and the sheer scale of the ambition of Blackpool as a town are the Tower, of course, and the Winter Gardens. Both for very different reasons and both appealing to some degree to different markets. The Tower today is considered, I guess, much more of a visitor's venue, but the Winter Gardens has always been, and is today, very much a venue where locals mingle with visitors. And I think that The sheer scale of the building, I mean, Historic England describe it as the largest, most ambitious and most complete building of its type in the United Kingdom. But it's this spirit of entrepreneurship that is a recurrent theme through the history of the Tower, the history of the Winter Gardens and other attractions in Blackpool. There was a huge amount of money to be made here. And if you think about how railway companies responded to this, you know, if you look at where all the main attractions are, they correspond to where Blackpool North Station is today, where Blackpool Central Station was, and where Blackpool South is today as well, with the piers. The piers are almost directly aligned, but the Winter Gardens and the Tower were put where they were partly to capture the huge numbers of excursion trains coming in at Blackpool Central and Blackpool North. They sort of hover between. That growth sort of continued from the end of the 19th century right through to probably just after the Second World War, when it began to slow. I don't think it stopped. I think there was still an awful lot going on, but it did slow down. And of course, today we've got this back to the future approach. The council, of course, have bought the Winter Gardens and the Tower. We own the transport company. And a lot of this is about using the assets that we have to help fund a future for the town.